The sun cast long shadows across the Arizona desert as Teresa Norris squinted at the broken wheel of her wagon. Her journey had been arduous enough before this final insult, a splintered wheel and a stubborn axle, 5 miles outside of Prescott. Sweat trickled down her neck as she kicked the useless wooden contraption, her frustration boiling over into a rare display of temper. The trunk containing everything she owned in this world sat exposed to the elements, and the desert heat showed no mercy to a woman alone. Teresa wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, and wisps of it stuck to her damp skin. She was 23, too old to be crying over a broken wagon, but the tears threatened nonetheless. This journey west was supposed to be her fresh start after the influenza took her parents last winter. Now, it seemed the West itself was rejecting her before she'd even arrived. "Miss, you seem to be in a spot of trouble." The deep voice startled her, and Teresa whirled around, hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer hidden in her skirt pocket. A man sat atop a chestnut stallion, silhouetted against the setting sun. As he moved closer, his features came into focus, a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble, piercing blue eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners, and a well-worn Stetson pushed back on his head. "Stay where you are," Teresa warned, though her voice trembled slightly. "I'm armed." The stranger raised his hands, palms out. "No need for that. Name's Daniel Hawkins. Most folks call me Dan. I'm just passing through and noticed you might need some assistance." Teresa studied him warily. He didn't look like an outlaw. His clothes were dusty but decent, and there was an honest quality to his face that put her slightly at ease. Still, a woman alone couldn't be too careful in 1875, especially this far from civilization. "My wagon wheel broke," she said unnecessarily, gesturing at the obvious damage. "I was headed to Prescott." Dan dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He approached the wagon slowly, keeping his movements deliberate as if dealing with a spooked horse. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the broken wheel. Teresa nodded, keeping a safe distance between them. He knelt beside the wagon, examining the damage with practiced hands. "Axle's cracked too. Must have hit that big outcropping back a ways." He glanced up at her. "You're lucky it didn't give out when you were crossing one of those ravines." "Lucky," Teresa repeated flatly, looking at her stranded possessions and the darkening sky. Dan's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Well, comparatively speaking." He stood and dusted off his hands. "I can fix this, but it'll take tools I don't have with me. Got a ranch about 3 miles northwest of here." "I can wait if you want to fetch your tools," Teresa offered. Dan shook his head, looking at the horizon. "Sun's setting. Not safe for a lady to be out here alone after dark. Coyotes, rattlers, and worse." "I'm not afraid," Teresa said, lifting her chin though her heartbeat quickened at the thought. "Didn't say you were afraid, just said it ain't safe." He studied her for a moment, seeming to make a decision. "Look, I can get your belongings loaded onto my horse, and we can lead him back to my place. I'll fix your wagon tomorrow and bring you into town if that's still where you want to go." Teresa hesitated. Following a stranger to his home went against everything she'd been taught. Yet the alternative, spending the night alone in the desert, seemed equally perilous. "I don't make a habit of going home with men I've just met, Mr. Hawkins. And I don't make a habit of inviting strangers to my ranch, Miss Norris. Teresa Norris. Miss Norris, then." Dan gestured to the setting sun. "But circumstances being what they are, I'm offering you a safe place to stay tonight, a fixed wagon tomorrow, and my word as a gentleman that you'll come to no harm under my roof." Teresa considered her options. The derringer in her pocket gave her some security, and something about Dan's straightforward manner seemed trustworthy. She'd come west to start a new life, to take risks she never would have back in Boston. "Very well, Mr. Hawkins," she said finally. "I accept your offer." Relief flickered across his features. "Good. Let's get your things packed up before we lose the light." Together, they transferred her trunk and other belongings to his horse, which stood patiently despite the added burden. Dan worked efficiently, his movements quick but careful with her possessions. When everything was secured, he offered Teresa a hand up onto his horse. "I'll walk alongside," he explained. "Not far to my place." As Teresa settled into the saddle, the enormity of what she was doing hit her. Here she was, following a stranger home, miles from anywhere with night falling around them. Yet instead of fear, she felt an unexpected flutter of something like anticipation. Dan looked up at her, his blue eyes catching the last rays of sunlight. "Ready?" Teresa nodded, gathering the reins in her hands. "Follow me home instead," Dan said with a slight smile, taking the horse's bridle and leading them away from the broken wagon and toward the unknown horizon. The journey to Dan's ranch took nearly an hour, with darkness falling completely before they arrived. Teresa's legs ached from the unaccustomed position in the saddle, and anxiety had begun to creep back in as they traveled further from the main road. Just as she was about to voice her concerns, a structure loomed ahead, a sturdy cabin with a small barn beside it, nestled against a rocky outcropping that offered natural protection from the wind. "Home," Dan announced, leading the horse into the yard. A dog barked from somewhere in the darkness, and Teresa tensed. "That's just Rusty," Dan explained. "He sounds fierce, but he's friendly as can be." As if on cue, a large brown dog bounded toward them, circling excitedly around Dan's legs before turning curious eyes to Teresa. "Down, Rusty," Dan commanded, and the dog obediently sat, though his tail continued to thump against the dirt. Dan reached up to help Teresa dismount. "Careful now." Teresa accepted his help, her legs wobbling slightly as they took her weight again. Dan's hands were strong and steady on her waist, and he released her as soon as she was balanced. "I'll see to the horse and your belongings," he said. "Doors unlocked. Make yourself comfortable." Teresa hesitated before heading toward the cabin. It was smaller than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney on one side. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, revealing a simple but tidy interior lit by a single oil lamp that Dan must have left burning before he departed earlier. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the cold fireplace. A bookshelf against one wall held more volumes than she would have expected, and a few simple sketches of the surrounding landscape were tacked to the walls. A door at the back presumably led to a bedroom. Teresa was still taking in her surroundings when Dan entered, carrying her smaller valise. "I'll bring the trunk in tomorrow," he said, setting down the bag. "Too heavy for tonight. Hope that's all right." "Of course," Teresa answered, suddenly acutely aware that she was alone with a man in his home, miles from the nearest neighbor. Yet the cabin, with its neat simplicity and the unexpected bookshelf, made her curious rather than fearful. "You have quite a collection of books." Dan glanced at the shelf, a flicker of something embarrassment crossing his features. "Reading passes the time in winter. There's not much else to do when the snow piles up." He moved to the stove, adding wood from a box beside it. "Are you hungry? I can heat up some stew." Teresa's stomach growled in response, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since midday. "Yes, thank you. Is there anything I can do to help?" "You can sit and rest. You've had a long day." He lit the stove with practiced movements. "The water barrel's outside if you want to wash up, Pump's frozen half the year, so I keep it filled." Teresa took the opportunity to step outside and splash cool water on her face and hands, washing away the dust of travel. When she returned, Dan had set the table with 2 bowls and was stirring something in a pot that smelled deliciously of beef and herbs. "It's nothing fancy," he said as he ladled stew into the bowls, "but it's hot." They ate in silence for a few minutes, Teresa suddenly ravenous. The stew was simple but flavorful, clearly made with care. "This is very good," she said, breaking the silence. "You're a better cook than I expected." Dan's mouth quirked up. "Man who can't cook out here is a man who starves. My mother made sure I could fend for myself before I left Kentucky." "Is that where you're from?" "Kentucky," he nodded. "Left after the war, wanted somewhere new, somewhere the fighting hadn't touched." Teresa studied him, trying to gauge his age. He was older than her, perhaps 30 or 31, old enough to have fought in the Civil War, though he hadn't said which side. "And your family?" she asked. "Parents passed on. Sister married and living in St. Louis." He took another bite before asking, "What brings you to Prescott, Miss Norris?" Teresa hesitated, then decided honesty was the simplest path. "I'm to be the new school teacher. They advertised back east for someone with education experience." She smiled slightly. "I taught at a ladies' academy in Boston for 3 years. When my parents died last winter, there was nothing keeping me there." Dan nodded, his expression softening. "I'm sorry about your parents. It's not easy losing family." "No, it isn't." Teresa looked down at her bowl. "But Prescott represents a fresh start. The school board seemed eager to have someone with formal training." "They would be. Town's growing fast. Lots of families moving in now that the Indian troubles have mostly settled." He paused. "Though I should warn you, it's not like Boston. Prescott's still rough around the edges." "I'm prepared for that," Teresa said, with more confidence than she felt. The truth was, despite her education, she'd led a sheltered life. The journey west had already shown her how unprepared she was for the realities of frontier life. Dan seemed to read her thoughts. "The broken wagon won't help your arrival, but I'll have you there by tomorrow afternoon. School doesn't start for another week, according to the notice in town." "You know about the school position?" "Small town," Dan said with a shrug. "Everyone knows everything. They've been talking about the new school teacher coming from back east for weeks." Teresa felt her cheeks warm. "I hope I don't disappoint them." "You won't." Dan stood and collected their empty bowls. "Those children need someone who cares enough to come all this way to teach them." He moved to a chest in the corner and pulled out some blankets. "You can take the bedroom tonight. I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Teresa protested. "You can and you will," Dan said firmly. "My mother would haunt me if I made a lady sleep on the floor." Teresa wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was settling into her bones. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins." "Dan," he corrected. "If you're sleeping under my roof, you might as well use my name." "Dan," she repeated, the informality feeling strange on her tongue. "Then you must call me Teresa." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Teresa, get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." As Teresa settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed in Dan's small bedroom, surrounded by the unfamiliar scents of sage and pine that clung to his blankets, she wondered at the strange turn her journey had taken. She'd expected to arrive in Prescott with time to settle before school began. Instead, she was spending her first night in Arizona territory in the cabin of a man she'd met just hours ago. Yet, as she drifted toward sleep, Teresa couldn't help but think that perhaps this detour was not entirely unfortunate after all. Teresa awoke to the aroma of coffee and the sound of movement in the main room. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, she tensed before remembering the events of the previous day. The broken wagon, the cowboy with kind eyes, his offer of shelter. Sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating the simple room. Besides the bed, there was only a chest for clothes and a small table with a basin and pitcher. The walls were bare except for a single photograph in a simple frame, a family portrait showing a younger Dan with what must be his parents and sister. Teresa rose and quickly made herself presentable, thankful that she'd included a change of clothes in her smaller valise. Her hair was another matter entirely, and she did her best to smooth it into a presentable bun without her usual array of pins and combs. When she emerged from the bedroom, Dan was at the stove, his back to her. He'd already been up for some time, judging by his freshly shaven jaw and damp hair. "Good morning," she said. Dan turned, a brief look of surprise crossing his features before he composed himself. "Morning. Sleep well, better than I expected," Teresa admitted. "Thank you again for your hospitality," he nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Coffee's hot." "Not much for breakfast except biscuits and bacon. Hope that'll do." "It sounds perfect." Teresa moved to help, but Dan waved her off. "Sit. It's nearly ready." Teresa settled at the table, watching as Dan efficiently moved around his small kitchen. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, the way he managed each task with minimal fuss. "Have you lived here long?" she asked as he placed a plate in front of her. 5 years. Dan poured coffee for them both before sitting down. "Worked as a ranch hand for a while after coming west. Saved enough to buy this place when the previous owner decided Arizona was too hot for his liking." "It is rather warm," Teresa said with a small smile, remembering her discomfort in the desert heat. "You'll get used to it." "Winters are mild, at least." Dan took a sip of his coffee. "I rode out at first light to check your wagon. The damage is worse than I thought." Teresa's heart sank. "Can it be repaired?" "Yes, but I'll need to replace both the wheel and part of the axle." "I've got what we need here, but it'll take most of the day." "I see." Teresa tried to hide her disappointment. She'd hoped to reach Prescott by midday to begin settling into her new life. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Dan shook his head. "Not with the wagon. But if you're set on keeping busy, I wouldn't say no to help with some of the chores around here." He paused. "If that's not too much to ask." "Not at all," Teresa assured him. In fact, she welcomed the opportunity to be useful rather than idle. "What needs doing?" Over breakfast, Dan outlined the day's work, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, tending to his small vegetable garden, and preparing a midday meal while he worked on the wagon. Simple tasks that Teresa was more than capable of handling, though her experience with chickens was limited to the occasional visit to her aunt's farm as a child. After breakfast, Dan showed her around the property. Besides the main cabin and barn, there was a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a fenced garden plot. A small creek ran nearby, providing water for the property. "It's not much," Dan said as they completed the tour, "but it's mine-free and clear." Teresa could hear the pride in his voice. "It's impressive what you've built here on your own." "Wasn't entirely on my own. Neighbors helped with the barn raising. That's how it works out here. Everybody pitches in when needed." The morning passed quickly as Teresa attended to her assigned tasks. The chickens were less intimidating than she'd feared, though one particularly bold hen took exception to Teresa's presence and pecked at her skirts indignantly. The garden yielded a bounty of late summer vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, and green beans that would make a fine addition to their midday meal. As she worked, Teresa found herself occasionally glancing toward the barn where Dan was laboring over her wagon. He'd shed his shirt in the growing heat, and she couldn't help but notice the play of muscles across his sun-bronzed back as he worked. Each time she caught herself looking, she quickly averted her gaze, cheeks warming at her own impropriety. By midday, Teresa had prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and freshly baked cornbread. She called Dan in from the barn, and he appeared, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd put his shirt back on, for which Teresa was both relieved and, surprisingly, a little disappointed. "Smells good," he said, washing up at the basin by the door. "How is the wagon coming along?" Teresa asked as they sat down to eat, making progress. "Should be ready by sundown." Dan hesitated. "But that means we won't reach town until tomorrow." Teresa nodded, accepting the news. Another night under Dan's roof was not the worst fate she could imagine. In fact, a small, surprising part of her was almost glad for the delay. "I hope I'm not imposing too much on your kindness," she said. Dan shook his head. "It's no imposition. Been a while since I had company out here." He took a bite of cornbread. "This is good. You're a fine cook." "Thank you, though I must admit I'm more accustomed to teaching grammar than making cornbread. Yet you do both well." Dan's blue eyes met hers across the table, and something in his gaze made her heart beat a little faster. After the meal, Dan returned to his work on the wagon, and Teresa busied herself with cleaning up and then tackling the mending she'd noticed in a basket by the rocking chair. She didn't presume to go through Dan's things, but the pile of socks and shirts with obvious tears sat right in plain sight, clearly awaiting attention. As she worked, Teresa found herself wondering about the life Dan had built here. It was a solitary existence from what she could tell. No mention of friends beyond the neighbors who helped with the barn. No sweetheart or wife, unless he was being particularly discreet. The cabin was comfortable, but showed the absence of a woman's touch. No curtains on the windows, no decorative touches beyond the practical. It was nearly sunset when Dan finally came in, looking tired but satisfied. "Wagon's fixed," he announced. "We can head to town first thing tomorrow." "Thank you," Teresa said, setting aside the shirt she'd been mending. "I've taken the liberty of repairing some of your clothes." "I hope you don't mind." Dan looked surprised, then pleased as he noticed the neat stack of mended garments. "Mind? No, that's kind of you." He ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing in endearing disarray. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." "It seems a small thing in return for all your help." Dan nodded, seeming at a loss for words. "I'll wash up and start supper," he said finally. "I already have stew simmering," Teresa told him. "From the vegetables I picked earlier, it should be ready soon." Again that look of surprised gratitude crossed his features. "You didn't have to cook again. As you said, we help each other out here." The evening meal was more relaxed than the previous nights, their conversation flowing more easily as they shared stories of their respective pasts. Teresa told him about growing up in Boston, her years at the Ladies' Academy, and her decision to come west after her parents' deaths. Dan spoke of his Kentucky childhood, his difficult years during the war, fighting for the Union, she was relieved to learn, and his gradual journey westward in search of a place to call his own. "What made you stop here?" Teresa asked as they lingered over coffee after the meal. Dan considered the question. "The land spoke to me, I suppose. First time I rode through this valley, something just felt right, like I belonged here." He glanced out the window at the darkening landscape. "Most folks think it's too isolated, too far from town, but I like the quiet." "It is beautiful," Teresa acknowledged. "Different from anything I'm used to, but I can see why you chose it." Dan studied her for a moment. "Town life will suit you better. Prescott's growing fast, got a proper hotel now and a theater. Sheriff keeps the peace well enough." "It sounds promising," Teresa said, though she felt a strange reluctance at the thought of reaching her destination tomorrow. These unexpected days with Dan had awoken something in her, a awareness of possibilities she hadn't considered when planning her new life. "You'll do well there," Dan said quietly. "Those children are lucky to have you as their teacher." The sincerity in his voice touched her. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the unexpected connection that had formed in such a short time. Dan was the first to look away. "We should get some rest. Early start tomorrow if we want to reach town before midday." That night, as Teresa once again lay in Dan's bed, she found sleep more elusive. Tomorrow she would reach Prescott, begin her new position, meet the people who would become her community. It was everything she had planned, everything she had journeyed west to find. Yet as she finally drifted toward sleep, Teresa couldn't shake the feeling that she might be leaving something important behind. Morning came too quickly. Teresa dressed with care, choosing her most presentable traveling outfit for her arrival in Prescott. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Dan already outside, loading her trunk onto the now repaired wagon. "I made coffee," he said when he came back in, "and there's some bread and preserves for breakfast." They ate quickly, neither speaking much. The easy conversation of the previous evening had been replaced by a strange, anticipatory tension. When it was time to depart, Teresa took a last look around the cabin that had been her unexpected sanctuary. "Ready?" Dan asked, standing by the door. "Yes," Teresa said, though in truth she wasn't sure. The journey to Prescott took most of the morning. Dan drove the wagon with Teresa beside him on the seat and his horse tethered behind. As they traveled, Dan pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, the hill, where a notorious stagecoach robbery had taken place 2 years prior, the creek where gold had briefly been discovered before the vein played out, the distant mountains where Apaches still occasionally came down to trade. Teresa listened attentively, asking questions and storing away the information for future use. If she was to make Prescott her home, she wanted to understand its history and geography. As they crested a final hill, the town came into view below them. It was larger than Teresa had expected, several streets of buildings spreading out from a central plaza, with a courthouse of impressive size dominating the landscape. "That's Prescott," Dan said, a note of pride in his voice. "Territorial capital, at least for now. They keep threatening to move it to Tucson." Teresa took in the sight, excitement and nervousness warring within her. This was to be her home, these people her new community. Yet as Dan guided the wagon down toward the town, she found herself glancing at his profile, wondering if she would see him again after today. The streets were busy with midday traffic, wagons and riders, pedestrians moving between businesses. Dan navigated with practiced ease, nodding to acquaintances as they passed. Finally, he pulled up in front of a tidy 2-story building with a sign identifying it as Wilcox Boarding House. "Mrs. Wilcox runs the best boarding house in town," Dan explained as he set the brake. "School board usually puts up the teacher here, at least to start." "You've been very thoughtful," Teresa said softly. "I don't know how to thank you properly." Dan shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just did what anyone would do." "No," Teresa said firmly. "Not anyone would have been so kind to a stranger." Before Dan could respond, the door of the boarding house opened, and a plump, gray-haired woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she called. "Daniel Hawkins, I haven't seen you in town for near a month." "And this must be our new school teacher." Dan helped Teresa down from the wagon. "Mrs. Wilcox, this is Miss Teresa Norris. Her wagon broke down yesterday, so I helped her with repairs." Mrs. Wilcox's eyes twinkled with interest as she looked between them. "Did it now?" "Well, how fortunate you were nearby, Daniel." She turned to Teresa with a warm smile. "Welcome to Prescott, Miss Norris. We've been so looking forward to your arrival. I have your room all ready." "Thank you," Teresa said, returning the smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Let's get your things inside, then," Mrs. Wilcox said. "Daniel, you'll help with the trunk, won't you?" Dan nodded and began unloading Teresa's belongings, with Mrs. Wilcox chattering about town news and the school, and which of the boarders Teresa would meet at supper. There was little opportunity for private conversation. Before Teresa knew it, her trunk and valise were in her new room on the second floor, and she was standing on the boarding house porch with Dan, saying goodbye. "The schoolhouse is just 2 blocks that way," he told her, pointing down the street. "General store's on the corner. Sheriff's office is across from the courthouse if you need anything." Teresa nodded, committing the directions to memory. "Thank you again, Dan, for everything." He shifted his weight, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "It was no trouble." A silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Finally, Dan settled his hat back on his head. "Well, I should be getting back. Chores won't do themselves." "Of course." Teresa tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. Will I see you in town again sometime?" Dan's eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought she saw the same reluctance she felt. "I don't make it to town much. Ranch keeps me busy." "I understand." Teresa extended her hand. "Goodbye then, Mr. Hawkins, and thank you for your kindness to a stranger." Dan took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Goodbye, Miss Norris. Good luck with your teaching." And then he was gone, climbing back onto his horse and riding away without looking back. Teresa watched until he disappeared around a corner, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. "Well now," Mrs. Wilcox said from the doorway behind her, "that's a man who doesn't come to town for just anyone." Teresa turned, composing her features. "He was very kind to help me when my wagon broke down." Mrs. Wilcox's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled by Teresa's casual tone. "Daniel Hawkins is one of the good ones. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a more honest man in the territory." She held the door open. "Come along, dear. Let me show you around, and then you can rest before supper. You must be tired after your journey." As Teresa followed Mrs. Wilcox inside, she couldn't help casting one last glance down the street where Dan had disappeared. She had reached her destination. Her new life in Prescott was about to begin. She should be feeling nothing but excitement and anticipation. So why did it feel like she'd left something important behind on a small ranch 3 miles outside of town? The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity as Teresa settled into her new life in Prescott. Mrs. Wilcox proved to be not only an excellent landlady, but also an invaluable guide to the social landscape of the town. Under her wing, Teresa met the members of the school board, was introduced to the mothers of many of her future pupils, and learned the complexities of Prescott society, which was considerably more developed than she had expected for a frontier town. The schoolhouse itself was a pleasant surprise, a solid building with proper desks, a good blackboard, and even a small library of books. Teresa spent hours preparing for her first day, organizing the classroom and reviewing the materials left by her predecessor. She was determined to make a good impression and to provide her students with the best education possible under the circumstances. Yet throughout the busy days, Teresa found her thoughts repeatedly straying to Dan Hawkins and his solitary ranch outside of town. More than once, she caught herself scanning the streets when in town, hoping for a glimpse of his tall figure. But he didn't appear, and Teresa tried to convince herself that her preoccupation was merely gratitude for his timely assistance. The day before school was to begin, Teresa was returning to the boarding house after purchasing some final supplies when she heard someone call her name. Turning, she saw a well-dressed woman hurrying toward her. "Miss Norris, I'm so glad I caught you. I'm Margaret Wilson, William Wilson's wife. He's on the school board. You met him at the reception." Teresa smiled politely, recalling the portly gentleman who had spoken at length about the importance of discipline in education. "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. How do you do?" "Very well, thank you. I wanted to personally invite you to our home for dinner this Sunday after church. It would give you a chance to meet some of the leading families in a more informal setting." "That's very kind of you," Teresa said, genuinely appreciative of the invitation. "I would be delighted to attend." Mrs. Wilson beamed. "Excellent, and do bring a gentleman friend if you'd like. I understand you've already made the acquaintance of Mr. Hawkins. He's a bit rough around the edges, of course, but a decent sort from what I hear." Teresa felt her cheeks warm. "Mr. Hawkins merely assisted me when my wagon broke down. We're not. That is, I wouldn't consider him a friend in that sense." "No. Well, perhaps that's for the best. A school teacher must be above reproach after all. Though I'm sure Daniel Hawkins would clean up nicely if someone took him in hand." Mrs. Wilson patted Teresa's arm. "In any case, we'll expect you at 1 o'clock on Sunday. The Blue House on Western Avenue, you can't miss it." As Mrs. Wilson bustled away, Teresa stood for a moment, unsettled by the conversation. The implication that Dan was somehow beneath her socially rankled, though she knew such attitudes were common enough. In Boston, too, social boundaries were clearly drawn and carefully maintained. Yet here on the frontier, where everyone faced the same harsh conditions and survival often depended on mutual aid, such distinctions seemed particularly meaningless. Later that evening, as Teresa sat in the boarding house parlor, reviewing her lesson plans for the 100th time, Mrs. Wilcox joined her. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" the older woman asked, settling into a chair with her knitting. "I believe so," Teresa said, though her stomach fluttered with nervous anticipation. "I just hope the children will respond well to my teaching methods." "They'll be lucky to have you," Mrs. Wilcox assured her. "Most of them are good kids, just need a firm hand and some patience." She worked a few stitches before adding casually, "Saw Daniel Hawkins in town today." Teresa's heart gave a traitorous leap. "Did you? Hum. At the mercantile, buying supplies. Asked after you." "He did." Teresa tried to keep her voice neutral, though she couldn't quite suppress the pleased note that crept in. Mrs. Wilcox's needles clicked steadily. "Said he wanted to make sure you were settling in all right. Told him you were doing just fine, getting ready for school to start." She glanced up with a knowing look. He seemed relieved to hear it. Teresa busied herself with reorganizing her papers. That was thoughtful of him. He's a thoughtful man. Not much for town life, but respected by those whose opinions matter. Mrs. Wilcox set her knitting aside. "You know, he helped build that schoolhouse you'll be teaching in. Volunteered his time when the town decided the old one was too small." "I didn't know that," Teresa said softly. "There's a lot about Daniel Hawkins that most folks don't know. Keeps to himself, like I said, but he's got a good heart." Mrs. Wilcox rose. "Well, I should check on supper, and you should get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day." As the older woman left, Teresa stared unseeing at her lesson plans. Dan had been in town, had asked about her. The knowledge warmed her in a way that felt dangerous and exciting all at once. The first day of school went better than Teresa could have hoped. Her 23 pupils, ranging in age from 6 to 16, proved attentive and mostly well-behaved. The older boys tested her authority, of course, but Teresa had dealt with their type before and quickly established that she would not be intimidated or manipulated. By the end of the week, she had settled into a comfortable routine. The children were responding well to her teaching. and she found herself genuinely enjoying the challenge of adapting her lessons to the varied needs and abilities of her pupils. Several parents had stopped by to introduce themselves and express appreciation for her work, which bolstered her confidence. Sunday arrived, and with it the dinner at the Wilsons'. Teresa dressed with care in her best afternoon dress, a deep blue that complemented her eyes. Mrs. Wilson had been right about her house. The blue-painted two-story on Western Avenue stood out among its neighbors, clearly built to impress, rather than merely to shelter. The interior was equally imposing, furnished with pieces that must have been shipped at great expense from the East. Teresa was introduced to several couples, a banker and his wife, a judge, the owner of the largest mercantile, and a young doctor recently arrived from Philadelphia. All were polite, even welcoming, though Teresa sensed she was being evaluated as much as welcomed. "Miss Norris, I understand you were rescued by Daniel Hawkins on your way to town," the banker's wife said as they sat down to dinner. "How fortunate that he happened to be passing by." "Indeed," Teresa agreed. "I don't know what I would have done without his assistance." "Hawkins keeps to himself mostly," the judge commented. "Good man with horses, though. Supplied my mare finest animal I've ever owned." "Does he raise horses, then?" Teresa asked, realizing how little she actually knew about Dan's livelihood. "Among other things," the banker said. "Started with just a few acres, but he's expanded. Does some cattle now, I believe, and has that new breeding operation. Shrewd businessman in his way." Teresa absorbed this information with interest. The judge and banker clearly respected Dan, which suggested his standing in the community was better than Mrs. Wilson had implied. "It's a shame he's such a recluse," Mrs. Wilson said. "A man with his attributes could do well in town if he applied himself properly." Teresa caught a flicker of something like disapproval in Mrs. Wilcox's eyes. She'd been invited as a long-time resident who could fill in the town's history for the newer arrivals. "Daniel Hawkins has his reasons for preferring the quiet life," Mrs. Wilcox said. "And he's done more for this town than most who live in it. Who do you think organized the rescue party when the Miller children went missing last winter? Or rebuilt the Widow Johnson's roof after that storm?" There was a momentary uncomfortable silence before the doctor smoothly changed the subject. Throughout the remainder of the meal, Teresa found herself increasingly curious about the man who had rescued her. Clearly, there was more to Dan Hawkins than she had discerned in their brief acquaintance. As Teresa walked back to the boarding house that evening, her mind was full of these new insights. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds. On impulse, she turned away from the direct route to the boarding house and walked toward the edge of town, where she could see the open countryside beyond. In the distance, the rolling hills faded into deepening shadows. Somewhere out there was Dan's ranch, his solitary cabin, the place where she'd spent 2 unexpectedly significant days. Teresa stood for a long moment, gazing in that direction, feeling a pull she couldn't quite explain. "Evening, Miss Norris." The familiar voice sent a shock through her. Teresa turned to find Dan himself, mounted on his chestnut stallion a few yards away. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her pulse quickening. "What a surprise!" He dismounted, leading his horse closer. In the fading light, his features were shadowed beneath his hat brim, but she could see that he'd shaved recently and wore a clean shirt. "Was just heading back from town," he explained. "Saw you standing here and thought I'd say hello. Make sure you're getting on all right." "I am, thank you." Teresa smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "The children are wonderful and everyone has been very kind." Dan nodded, seeming relieved. "Good, that's good." He shifted his weight, apparently unsure what to say next. "How's the wagon holding up?" "Perfectly well. Your repairs were excellent." Another silence fell between them, weighted with unspoken thoughts. "I was at the Wilsons' for dinner," Teresa said finally. "They mentioned you raise horses." Dan's posture relaxed slightly, on more comfortable ground with this topic. "That's right. Started with just a few, but I've built up a decent breeding operation now. Got some of the finest stock in the territory." The judge spoke highly of the mare he purchased from you. A hint of pride crossed Dan's features. "Moonshadow, she's a good horse. Still have her dam and sire at the ranch." "It sounds like a substantial operation," Teresa observed. "You must be very busy. Keeps me occupied." Dan glanced back toward town, then at Teresa again. "You shouldn't be out here alone with night coming on. Let me walk you back." Teresa wanted to protest that Prescott was perfectly safe, but the opportunity to spend a few more minutes in Dan's company was too tempting to refuse. "Thank you. That would be kind." They walked side by side, Dan leading his horse as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Neither spoke for several moments, but the silence was companionable rather than awkward. "Mrs. Wilcox tells me you helped build the schoolhouse," Teresa said at last. Dan shrugged. "Just lent a hand when they needed it. Nothing special." "It means something to me," Teresa said quietly. "To know that you helped create the place where I'll be teaching." Dan glanced at her, his expression softening. "It's a good building, solid. Should serve the town for many years." After a pause, he added, "How long do you plan to stay in Prescott?" The question caught Teresa off guard. In truth, she hadn't thought beyond establishing herself in her new position. "I'm not sure. The school board offered a 1-year contract to start, but they indicated they hope for a longer commitment." "And do you hope for a longer commitment?" Teresa considered the question. "I think I could be happy here. The town is welcoming, the children are eager to learn, and the landscape." She looked toward the distant mountains, silhouetted against the twilight sky. "It has a beauty I never expected." Dan followed her gaze. "It grows on you." "I couldn't imagine living anywhere else now." They had reached the boarding house. Teresa turned to face Dan, reluctant for their brief encounter to end. "It was good to see you again, Mr. Hawkins." "Dan," he reminded her. "Dan," she acknowledged with a small smile. "Will you be coming to town again soon?" He hesitated. "Got some business at the bank next week. Might be in on Wednesday. Perhaps we could. That is, if you have time, maybe we could have coffee at the hotel restaurant." The invitation was forward, perhaps inappropriately so, but Teresa found she didn't care. Dan's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "I'd like that. Noon." "Noon," Teresa confirmed, her heart lightening. "I'll look forward to it." Dan tipped his hat. "As will I, Miss Norris." "Teresa," she corrected gently. "Teresa," he repeated, the name sounding different, special in his deep voice. "Good night." "Good night, Dan." As she watched him mount his horse and ride away, Teresa felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with her teaching duties and everything to do with Wednesday's promised meeting. She knew that, as the town's schoolteacher, she would be subject to scrutiny, that her behavior must be above reproach. A friendship with Dan Hawkins would be acceptable, but anything more might raise eyebrows. Yet as she entered the boarding house, Teresa found she didn't much care what others might think. For the first time since arriving in Prescott, she felt truly excited about something beyond her classroom. And if that something happened to be a quiet cowboy with kind eyes who had once fixed her broken wagon, well, perhaps that was exactly what her new life needed. Wednesday couldn't come quickly enough for Teresa. The days dragged despite her busy schedule, and by the time Wednesday morning arrived, she found herself changing her dress 3 times before settling on a forest green that Mrs. Wilcox had once commented brought out the color in her cheeks. "My, don't we look pretty today, Mrs. Wilcox observed as Teresa came down for breakfast. Any special occasion, Teresa busied herself with pouring coffee. Just feeling well rested, that's all. Mrs. Wilcox's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled, but she merely smiled and passed the plate of biscuits. Well, you certainly deserve a nice day after all your hard work with those children. Mr. Peterson was just telling me yesterday how his Johnny has never been so excited about school. Johnny has a natural aptitude for mathematics, Teresa said, grateful for the change of subject. I've given him some advanced problems to work on. The morning's classes seemed interminable. Teresa found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the small clock on her desk, watching the minutes tick by with excruciating slowness. When noon finally approached, she dismissed the children for their midday break with perhaps more enthusiasm than usual. The hotel restaurant was one of the more refined establishments in Prescott, catering to travelers and the town's upper echelon. Teresa arrived a few minutes before noon, her stomach fluttering with nerves. She chose a table near the window, where she could watch for Dan's arrival while appearing to be simply enjoying the view. Noon came and went. By 12:15, Teresa was beginning to worry. By 12:30, worry had given way to embarrassment as she sat alone, having already declined the waiter's offers of food twice. Had she misunderstood? Had Dan changed his mind? Just as she was about to give up and leave, the restaurant door opened and Dan hurried in. His clothes were dusty, his hair tousled, and he looked harried. When he spotted her, relief washed over his features. "I'm sorry," he said as he reached her table, removing his hat. "One of the mares went into labor unexpectedly. Couldn't leave until I knew she and the foal were all right." Teresa's disappointment vanished. "Are they all right?" Dan nodded, taking the seat across from her. "Healthy colt, strong lungs. First-time mother, so she needed some help, but they'll do fine." He ran a hand through his hair, looking chagrined. "I must look a sight. Didn't have time to clean up properly." "You look like a man who just delivered a new life," Teresa said warmly. "That's nothing to apologize for." The tension in Dan's shoulders eased. "Still, I'm sorry to keep you waiting." "It was worth the wait," Teresa said, then flushed as she realized how the words might sound. "That is, I'm glad you were able to come at all under the circumstances." The waiter approached and they ordered coffee for both, steak for Dan, chicken for Teresa. As they waited for their food, the initial awkwardness faded, and conversation flowed more easily. "How are your classes going?" Dan asked. Teresa found herself telling him about her students, bright Johnny Peterson, shy Eliza Jenkins, who had a gift for poetry, the Miller twins, who were forever finishing each other's sentences. Dan listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest. "You care about them already," he observed as their food arrived. "It shows in your voice." Teresa hadn't realized it herself until he pointed it out. "I suppose I do. They're all so different with such potential. Even Thomas Blackwood, who spends more time causing mischief than studying." "Martin Blackwood's boy," Dan shook his head. "That family's had it rough since his mother passed. Martin works the mine long hours, boys probably just looking for attention." The insight gave Teresa pause. "I hadn't considered that. Perhaps I should speak with his father." "Might help," Dan agreed. "Or give the boy some extra responsibilities. Make him feel important." They continued talking through the meal, moving from school matters to Teresa's impressions of Prescott, to Dan's experiences establishing his ranch. Time slipped away unnoticed until the waiter discreetly informed them that Teresa's afternoon classes would be starting in 15 minutes. "Oh," Teresa exclaimed, startled by how quickly the time had passed. "I must go. The children will be waiting." Dan immediately asked for the bill. "I'll walk you back to the schoolhouse." They hurried through the busy streets, Teresa conscious of curious glances from passers-by. The school teacher dining with the reclusive rancher would certainly give the town something to talk about. At the schoolhouse steps, they paused. "Thank you for meeting me," Teresa said. "I enjoyed our conversation very much, as did I." Dan's blue eyes were warm as they met hers. Perhaps we could do it again sometime." Teresa's heart lifted. "I'd like that." A group of children rounded the corner, calling out greetings when they spotted their teacher. Dan stepped back, replacing his hat. "I should let you get to your duties. Good day, Miss Norris." "Good day, Mr. Hawkins," Teresa responded, matching his formal tone for the benefit of the approaching children. But the smile they shared held nothing of formality, only a growing understanding and the promise of future meetings. As the weeks passed, those meetings became a cherished part of Teresa's life in Prescott. Dan found reasons to come to town more frequently, supplies to purchase, business at the bank, horses to deliver to customers. And each time, he would find a way to see Teresa, whether for a proper meal at the hotel restaurant or simply a brief conversation on the schoolhouse steps. October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the vibrant colors of autumn to the landscape around Prescott. Teresa had fully settled into her role as teacher, earning the respect of her pupils and their parents alike. Her boarding house room had become a home of sorts, decorated with small treasures, pressed wildflowers Dan had shown her on a Sunday afternoon walk, a beautiful quartz crystal one of her students had found, a sketch of the schoolhouse drawn by a traveling artist. Yet despite her contentment with her professional life, Teresa found herself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Dan. Their friendship had grown deeper with each meeting, their conversations more personal and meaningful. She had learned about his experiences during the war, the loss of his parents to influenza a year apart, his dream of building a horse breeding operation renowned throughout the territory. He, in turn, had listened as she spoke of her sheltered Boston upbringing, her decision to become a teacher despite her family's preference that she make a suitable marriage, and her grief when illness took both her parents in the same terrible winter. What had begun as gratitude and curiosity had blossomed into something far more significant, at least for Teresa. Whether Dan felt the same remained uncertain. He was unfailingly kind, attentive, and respectful, but he maintained a certain reserve that Teresa couldn't quite penetrate. Was it simply his nature, or was he deliberately keeping her at arm's length? These thoughts occupied Teresa's mind as she walked home from school one crisp October afternoon. The town was preparing for its harvest festival, and merchants were decorating their storefronts with autumn themes. Teresa paused to admire the display in the mercantile window when she heard her name called. "Miss Norris, a moment, please." Teresa turned to see Mrs. Wilson approaching, accompanied by a well-dressed gentleman she didn't recognize. "Miss Norris, how fortunate to encounter you," Mrs. Wilson said. "I wanted to introduce you to my cousin, Mr. James Hartford. He's visiting from San Francisco and will be staying through the Harvest Festival." The gentleman stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and pleasant features. "Miss Norris, a pleasure to meet you. Margaret has spoken highly of Prescott's new schoolteacher." "Mr. Hartford," Teresa acknowledged with a polite nod. "Welcome to Prescott. James is a partner in a law firm in San Francisco," Mrs. Wilson explained, her tone suggesting this was information Teresa should find impressive. "He's considering opening a branch office here in Prescott as the territory grows." "An ambitious plan," Teresa commented. Mr. Hartford smiled. "One must look to the future, Miss Norris. Arizona will be a state within the decade, I'm certain of it, and Prescott is positioned to become an important center of commerce." "Indeed." Teresa glanced toward the boarding house, eager to end the conversation. Something in Mrs. Wilson's manner made her uneasy, a certain calculating look that suggested this meeting was not as coincidental as it appeared. "We're having a small dinner party tomorrow evening," Mrs. Wilson said, confirming Teresa's suspicion. "Nothing formal, just a few friends to welcome James to Prescott. We would be delighted if you could join us." Teresa hesitated. She had planned to use the evening to grade essays and prepare for the following week's lessons, but refusing would be impolite, especially given Mrs. Wilson's husband's position on the school board. "Thank you for the invitation," she said finally. "I would be happy to attend." "Excellent," Mrs. Wilson beamed. 7 o'clock then. James will look forward to continuing your acquaintance." Mr. Hartford inclined his head. "Most certainly." "Perhaps you could tell me more about the educational needs of the community, Miss Norris. If I am to establish a practice here, I should understand all aspects of Prescott's development." "I would be glad to," Teresa said, though in truth, she had little interest in discussing education or anything else with Mr. Hartford. Something about his too smooth manner reminded her uncomfortably of the suitors her parents had once encouraged, men who viewed her as a suitable ornament for their aspirations, rather than a person with dreams of her own. After a few more minutes of polite conversation, Teresa excused herself and continued to the boarding house. As she climbed the steps to her room, she found herself wishing that it was Dan she would be seeing tomorrow evening rather than the polished Mr. Hartford. The dinner party was exactly as Teresa had expected, elegant by Prescott standards, with Mrs. Wilson making every effort to impress her San Francisco cousin with the town's sophistication. The other guests included the banker and his wife, the judge, the young doctor, and the owner of the largest mercantile, the same group from the previous dinner, minus Mrs. Wilcox. Teresa noted. Mr. Hartford was seated beside Teresa, a placement that could hardly be coincidental. Throughout the meal, he directed most of his conversation to her, asking thoughtful questions about the school and her experiences in Prescott. Under other circumstances, Teresa might have found him engaging company. He was well educated, articulate, and clearly intelligent. But her responses remained politely formal, her mind elsewhere. "Miss Norris seems distracted this evening," Mrs. Wilson observed during dessert, her tone playful but her eyes sharp. "Perhaps she's thinking of the Harvest Festival. I understand Mr. Hawkins has offered one of his horses for the children's rides." Teresa looked up, startled by the mention of Dan. "Has he? That's very generous." "Yes, quite," Mrs. Wilson said, "though I was surprised to hear he'll be attending the festival himself. He usually avoids town gatherings." "Daniel Hawkins is a man of contradictions," the judge commented. "Private as they come most days, then unexpectedly in the thick of things when you least expect it." Mr. Hartford leaned toward Teresa. "This Mr. Hawkins sounds like an interesting character." "You're acquainted with him, I gather?" "Mr. Hawkins assisted me when my wagon broke down on my arrival in Prescott," Teresa explained, keeping her tone neutral despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "He's been very kind in helping me acclimate to life here." "Kind, yes, Mrs. Wilson said with a meaningful look at her cousin, though perhaps a bit rough around the edges for someone of Miss Norris's refinement. Teresa felt her cheeks warm, more with anger than embarrassment. "On the contrary, I find Mr. Hawkins to be one of the most genuine and honorable people I've met in Prescott. His manner may not be polished, but his character is above reproach." A brief silence followed this declaration. The banker cleared his throat. "Well said, Miss Norris. Daniel Hawkins is a credit to this community, for all his eccentricities." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Teresa remained unsettled by the exchange. Mrs. Wilson's attempt to disparage Dan in front of her cousin, and the implication that Teresa should find Mr. Hartford more suitable company, was as transparent as it was unwelcome. When the evening finally ended, Mr. Hartford insisted on escorting Teresa back to the boarding house, despite her assurances that the short walk was perfectly safe. "I've enjoyed our conversation immensely, Miss Norris," he said as they reached the boarding house steps. "Perhaps you would do me the honor of accompanying me to the Harvest Festival. As a newcomer to Prescott, I would benefit from your insights into the community." Teresa hesitated. Refusing outright would be rude, yet accepting felt somehow disloyal to her feelings for Dan. "That's kind of you, Mr. Hartford, but I've already promised to help with the children's games during the festival. My time will not be my own." "Perhaps another occasion then," Mr. Hartford said smoothly. "I'll be in Prescott for at least 2 weeks." Teresa nodded noncommittally. "Good night, Mr. Hartford. Thank you for escorting me home." As she prepared for bed that night, Teresa found herself thinking about Dan's unexpected plan to attend the Harvest Festival. He'd made no mention of it during their last meeting a few days earlier. Was Mrs. Wilson correct? Did his decision to attend represent a change in his usual habits? And if so, what had prompted it? The Harvest Festival arrived on a perfect autumn Saturday, crisp air, clear skies, and the mountains surrounding Prescott ablaze with fall colors. The town square had been transformed, with booths offering games and local crafts, tables laden with food, and a wooden platform for dancing. Children ran excitedly from attraction to attraction, their usual decorum forgotten in the festive atmosphere. Teresa had indeed volunteered to oversee the children's games, partly out of genuine interest and partly to have a legitimate reason to avoid Mr. Hartford's attentions. By midday, she was pleasantly tired, but enjoying the children's enthusiasm. She had just finished organizing a sack race when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Looks like you have them well in hand." Teresa turned to find Dan standing there, looking more dressed up than she'd ever seen him, clean shirt, vest, and his best hat, his boots polished to a shine. "Dan, you came." She couldn't keep the pleasure from her voice. "Said I would, didn't I?" His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Brought gentle lady for the children's rides. She's good with little ones." Teresa glanced toward the far side of the square, where a beautiful dappled mare was indeed giving rides to delighted children, led around a small circuit by one of the local stable hands. "That was generous of you," she said. "The children are thrilled." Dan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's nothing. Horse needed the exercise anyway." He looked around at the festival. "This is quite a production." "It is," Teresa agreed. "Have you been to the festival before?" "Not for a few years," Dan admitted. "Not much for crowds usually." The admission confirmed what Mrs. Wilson had said about his habits, making Teresa all the more curious about his presence today. "What changed your mind this year?" Dan's eyes met hers, something unreadable in their blue depths. "Had my reasons." Before Teresa could ask what those reasons might be, a voice called her name. Turning, she saw Mr. Hartford approaching, resplendent in a tailored suit that must have come from San Francisco. "Miss Norris, I've been looking for you," he said, then noticed Dan. "Oh, excuse me. I didn't mean to interrupt." Teresa felt suddenly caught between two worlds: the polished, urbane society Mr. Hartford represented, and the straightforward, honest life epitomized by Dan. "Mr. Hartford, this is Daniel Hawkins," she said, making the introduction with careful formality. "Dan, this is James Hartford, Mrs. Wilson's cousin from San Francisco." The two men sized each other up as they exchanged greetings. The contrast between them could hardly have been more pronounced. Mr. Hartford in his city clothes with manicured hands and practiced smile. Dan in his simple but clean attire. His face weathered by years of outdoor work, his handshake firm and calloused. "Mr. Hawkins," Mr. Hartford said, "I understand you're something of a horse expert. The mare giving the children rides is yours." "One of mine," Dan confirmed, his expression neutral. "Beautiful animal," Mr. Hartford said. "I know little about horses myself." "More comfortable in a courtroom than a stable, I'm afraid." "Different skills for different lives," Dan said with a slight shrug. An awkward silence fell. Teresa found herself desperately searching for a neutral topic to ease the tension. "The children's games are about to resume," she said finally. "I should get back to my duties." "Of course," Mr. Hartford said. "I actually came to ask if you might join me for dinner later. Mrs. Wilson has arranged a gathering at the hotel restaurant." Before Teresa could formulate a response, Dan spoke. "If you'll both excuse me, I should check on gentle lady, make sure she's not getting tired." He tipped his hat and walked away before Teresa could protest. She watched him go, a knot forming in her stomach. "Miss Norris." Mr. Hartford prompted. "Dinner," Teresa turned back to him, making a quick decision. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartford, I've already made other arrangements for this evening." His eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Another time, perhaps." "Perhaps," Teresa said, though she had no intention of accepting any future invitations. "If you'll excuse me, the children are waiting." As Mr. Hartford walked away, Teresa glanced in the direction Dan had gone. She could see him now with his mare, checking the animal's legs and speaking softly to her. The decision to decline Mr. Hartford's invitation had been easy, far easier than she would have expected a few months ago. Whatever her feelings for Dan, and she was increasingly certain of what those feelings were, she had no interest in encouraging Mr. Hartford's attentions. The afternoon continued with more games and festivities. Teresa caught glimpses of Dan occasionally as he moved around the festival, speaking with farmers and ranchers he knew, stopping to watch some of the competitions. Once, their eyes met across the square, and he nodded slightly before continuing his conversation with the blacksmith. As the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the square, and the band took its place on the platform. The dancing would begin soon, a highlight of the festival that everyone looked forward to all year. Teresa had just finished putting away the last of the game equipment when she felt someone approach. Turning, she found Dan standing there, hat in hand. "Miss Norris," he said, more formal than usual. "I was wondering if you might honor me with a dance this evening." The request took her by surprise. In all their conversations, Dan had never mentioned dancing. "I'd be delighted," she said, her heart suddenly racing. "Though I should warn you, it's been some time since I danced." "That makes two of us," Dan said with a small smile. "But I reckon we can manage not to step on each other's toes too badly." As they walked toward the dance area, Teresa was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. The school teacher and the reclusive rancher, they made an unexpected pair. The band struck up a lively tune and couples took to the floor. Dan held out his hand, and Teresa placed hers in it, allowing him to lead her into the dance. His hand at her waist was respectful, the proper distance maintained between them. Yet Teresa felt a warmth spreading through her at his touch. To her surprise, Dan was a competent dancer. Not polished like the dancing masters of Boston, but confident in his movements, guiding her smoothly through the steps. "You dance well," she said as they moved around the floor. "My mother insisted all her children learn," Dan explained. "Said it was a necessary social skill, even on the frontier." "She was right," Teresa said, "though I confess I didn't expect." Didn't expect a rough cowboy to know how to dance. There was no offense in his tone, only a gentle teasing. Teresa flushed. That's not what I meant. I know. His eyes held hers, warm with understanding. People see what they expect to see most times. The quiet rancher who keeps to himself. The refined schoolteacher from Boston makes it simple for them, comfortable. And what do you see, Dan Hawkins? Teresa asked softly, the question more revealing than she'd intended. The music slowed and their steps with it. For a moment, Dan didn't answer, his expression thoughtful. I see a woman braver than she knows, he said finally, who left everything familiar to make a new life where most ladies of her background wouldn't dare to go, who cares about children that aren't hers, who defends a man others might look down on, who sees beauty in a harsh land. His hand tightened slightly at her waist. I see you, Teresa. The simple words touched her deeply. And I see you, she whispered. Not just the quiet rancher, but the man who builds schoolhouses and rescues stranded travelers and raises horses with such care and pride. The music ended, but neither moved to break apart immediately. Something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for weeks. Finally, Dan stepped back, releasing her hand reluctantly. Would you walk with me, away from the crowds for a bit? Teresa nodded, her pulse quickening. Together they moved away from the dance floor, past the booths and tables, to a quieter area at the edge of the square. A few couples strolled nearby, but they had relative privacy. I've been meaning to ask you something, Dan said as they walked slowly beneath the trees. Yes. Teresa prompted when he didn't continue immediately. Dan stopped, turning to face her. In the lantern light, his expression was serious. The Harvest Festival isn't the only celebration coming up. Town's planning a Thanksgiving gathering, each family bringing food to share at the town hall. I've heard about it, Teresa said. Mrs. Wilcox mentioned it last week. I was wondering. Dan hesitated, then straightened his shoulders as if coming to a decision. I was wondering if you'd consider coming out to the ranch that day instead, for dinner, just the two of us. The invitation was significant. Teresa understood that immediately. Dan wasn't simply asking her to a meal. He was taking a deliberate step toward something more personal. I'd like that very much, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Relief and something like joy spread across Dan's features. Good, that's good. Before either could say more, a voice called Teresa's name. Looking around, she saw Mrs. Wilcox approaching, her expression concerned. Teresa, dear, there you are. Mrs. Jenkins is looking for you. Something about Eliza feeling ill. The poor child is quite upset. I should go, Teresa said to Dan, genuinely reluctant to end their time together. Eliza is one of my most sensitive students, of course. Dan nodded, understanding. I need to take gentle lady home soon anyway. Teresa hesitated, then made a quick decision. Reaching out, she squeezed his hand briefly. Thank you for the dance, Dan, and for the invitation. I'm looking forward to Thanksgiving. His fingers curled around hers for a moment. So am I. As Teresa hurried away with Mrs. Wilcox, the older woman gave her a knowing look. Daniel Hawkins attending the festival and dancing in public now, there's something I never expected to see. Teresa couldn't suppress a smile. People can surprise you, Mrs. Wilcox. Indeed they can, dear. Indeed they can. In the weeks following the Harvest Festival, Teresa found herself counting the days until Thanksgiving. Her anticipation was not lost on Mrs. Wilcox, who observed with characteristic directness that Teresa seemed especially cheerful for someone facing a hard winter. The festival had marked a turning point in Teresa's relationship with Dan. Though their meetings remained proper walks after church, occasional lunches at the hotel restaurant, there was a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement of deeper feelings that needed no words. Mr. Hartford, apparently undeterred by Teresa's polite rebuffs, called at the boarding house twice more before returning to San Francisco. His parting words suggested he would return in the spring, a prospect Teresa met with carefully concealed dismay. November brought the first dusting of snow to the hills around Prescott. The days grew shorter, the nights crisp and clear, with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Teresa added extra reading and arithmetic lessons to her teaching schedule, keeping the children engaged during the hours they could no longer play outdoors. On the Monday before Thanksgiving, as Teresa was dismissing her students for the day, she was surprised to see Dan's tall figure waiting outside the schoolhouse. Since the festival, he'd been careful about calling on her at school, mindful of the town's watchful eyes and Teresa's position. "Everything all right?" she asked as she approached him, concern immediately rising at his unexpected appearance. "Fine," he assured her, though there was a tension in his manner that belied the word. "Just needed to speak with you." Teresa glanced around. Several students lingered nearby, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Let's walk," she suggested. They moved down the street toward the edge of town, Dan shortening his stride to match hers. Neither spoke until they were beyond the children's hearing. "What is it?" Teresa asked. "You seem troubled." Dan sighed, his breath visible in the cool air. "Got word yesterday. My sister in St. Louis is ill, pneumonia. Her husband sent a telegram asking me to come." "Oh, Dan, I'm so sorry." Teresa's heart sank, both for his sister's condition and for what this must mean. "You'll be leaving right away," he nodded grimly. "Train east tomorrow morning. Don't know how long I'll be gone. Could be weeks." "Of course you must go," Teresa said, pushing aside her disappointment. "Family comes first." "I hate to leave the ranch," Dan said. "Neighbors will help some, but it's a lot to ask during winter." "And I hate that we won't have our Thanksgiving dinner," Teresa admitted softly. Dan stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression softened. "That's what I wanted to tell you in person. I wouldn't miss it without good reason." "I know that," Teresa assured him, reaching out impulsively to touch his arm. "Your sister needs you. That's what matters now." Dan covered her hand with his own. "I've been thinking about our dinner since the festival, looking forward to it more than I can say." The admission warmed Teresa despite the cold air. "As have I." They stood for a moment in silence, hands joined, the unspoken growing between them. "I should get you back," Dan said finally. "It's getting colder." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Teresa found herself wondering when she would see him again. The thought of weeks without his company left an emptiness she hadn't expected. At the boarding house steps, they paused. "I'll write," Dan promised. "Let you know how things are. When I might return." "I'll pray for your sister's recovery," Teresa said, "and for your safe journey." Dan seemed to struggle with himself for a moment, then stepped closer. "Teresa, I want you to know. That is, I hope you understand what." He stopped, frustrated with his own inarticulateness. "I understand," Teresa said softly, and she did. Whatever was growing between them didn't need formal declarations yet. Dan's relief was visible. "Good. That's good." He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. Bringing it to his lips, he pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved fingers. "Until I return, then." "Until then," Teresa echoed, her heart racing at the gesture. With a final nod, Dan turned and walked away. Teresa watched until he disappeared around a corner, a strange mixture of sadness and hope filling her. Mrs. Wilcox was waiting inside, her expression a blend of sympathy and curiosity. "Daniel looked serious when he came asking for you," she said. "Nothing wrong, I hope?" Teresa explained about Dan's sister and his imminent departure. "Poor man," Mrs. Wilcox said. "And poor you, missing your special dinner." Teresa looked sharply at the older woman. "How did you know about that?" Mrs. Wilcox smiled. "My dear, I've been watching young people fall in love for 50 years. You think I can't recognize the signs?" We. Teresa faltered, then gave up the pretense. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who knows what to look for," Mrs. Wilcox assured her. "Though I expect half the town has noticed Daniel Hawkins finding more reasons to come to town in the last 2 months than in the previous 2 years." Teresa felt her cheeks warm. "He's been very kind since my arrival." "Kind isn't the word I'd use," Mrs. Wilcox said shrewdly. "But never mind that now. You'll be joining us for Thanksgiving dinner here, of course. No sense in being alone on the holiday." "Thank you," Teresa said, grateful for the older woman's matter-of-fact kindness. "I'd like that." That night, as Teresa prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of Dan already miles away by now, on his way to St. Louis and an uncertain future. She hadn't realized until today just how deeply he had become woven into her life in Prescott, how much she looked forward to their meetings, their conversations, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. "Be safe," she whispered to the dark room. "Come back to me." The weeks that followed were both busy and oddly empty for Teresa. The Thanksgiving gathering at the boarding house was pleasant enough, good food and warm company, but she couldn't help thinking of the meal that might have been, just her and Dan at his ranch. December arrived with more snow and preparations for Christmas. Teresa threw herself into planning a Christmas pageant with her students, organizing rehearsals and helping with costumes. The activity kept her from dwelling too much on Dan's absence, though she found herself eagerly checking for mail each day. His first letter arrived 10 days after his departure, a brief note explaining that he had reached St. Louis safely, but found his sister very ill. The doctor was hopeful, but recovery would be slow. Dan wrote that he expected to remain through Christmas at least. Teresa wrote back immediately, expressing her concern for his sister and assuring him that his neighbors were keeping an eye on his ranch. She described the town's Christmas preparations, her students' excitement about the pageant, the first heavy snow that had blanketed Prescott in white. She hesitated over the closing, finally settling on "with warm regards," though the words seemed inadequate for what she truly felt. 2 more letters came from Dan before Christmas, each a bit longer than the last, as if he were becoming more comfortable with writing. His sister was slowly improving, he reported, but remained weak. His brother-in-law was overwhelmed, trying to manage his business and care for their 2 young children while worrying about his wife. Dan had extended his stay to help with the children, a task he described with self-deprecating humor. "Never knew how much energy 2 small boys could have," he wrote. "Makes wrangling wild horses seem restful by comparison, but they're good lads, just scared about their mother. Reminds me how hard it was losing our parents. At least these boys won't have to face that, God willing." Teresa found herself smiling as she read his descriptions of life in St. Louis, so different from Prescott, with its bustle and noise and crowded streets. Dan sounded out of place there, a feeling Teresa understood well from her own adjustment to the West. The Christmas pageant was a success, with even troublesome Thomas Blackwood performing his part as a shepherd without incident. Parents beamed with pride, children sang carols with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and for a few hours the town came together in celebration of the season. As Teresa walked home from the church that evening, snow falling gently around her, she found herself missing Dan with an ache that surprised her with its intensity. They'd known each other barely 4 months, yet she couldn't imagine Prescott couldn't imagine her life without him now. Christmas at the boarding house was cheerful, with Mrs. Wilcox decorating every available surface and preparing enough food for twice their number. Teresa received small gifts from her students and their parents' handkerchiefs, home-preserved jams, a beautiful quilt made by several mothers working together. But the gift that meant the most arrived by post on Christmas Eve, a small package from St. Louis. Inside, Teresa found a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a rose and a note in Dan's now familiar handwriting. Saw this and thought of you. Roses don't grow easily in Arizona, but they do grow. Take special care, the right conditions and patience. Some things are worth the effort. Teresa pinned the brooch to her dress for Christmas dinner, touching it occasionally as if to reassure herself of its presence. When Mrs. Wilson commented on the lovely new trinket, Teresa merely smiled and changed the subject. New Year came and went with no word from Dan. Teresa tried not to worry, telling herself that mail was often delayed in winter, that his sister's condition might require his continued presence, that he would return when he could. January brought bitter cold and fewer opportunities to venture outdoors. Teresa's students, confined to the schoolhouse during breaks, grew restless. She devised new games and lessons to keep them engaged, but found her own spirits flagging as the month wore on with no letter from St. Louis. It was late January when Mrs. Wilcox entered the boarding house parlor where Teresa sat grading arithmetic papers and announced without preamble, "Daniel Hawkins is back." Teresa's head shot up. "He's here. In town. Rode in this afternoon, according to Mr. Peterson. Said he looked tired but well enough." Mrs. Wilcox studied Teresa's face. "Thought you'd want to know." "Yes, thank you," Teresa said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the sudden racing of her heart. "Did Mr. Peterson say anything else? About his sister? Recovering, I gather." "Well enough that Daniel felt he could leave her in her husband's care." Mrs. Wilcox sat down across from Teresa. "You should know there's been talk while he was away about you and him." Teresa set down her pen. "What kind of talk?" "The usual kind. Speculation about intentions. Questions about suitability." Mrs. Wilcox's direct gaze held no judgment, only concern. "Not everyone thinks a schoolteacher should be keeping company with a rancher, no matter how respected he might be." "By not everyone, I assume you mean Mrs. Wilson and her circle," Teresa said with more sharpness than she'd intended. "Among others," Mrs. Wilcox confirmed. "You should be prepared. If Daniel comes calling, it won't go unremarked." Teresa straightened her shoulders. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Wilcox. But I'm not ashamed of my friendship with Dan. If others choose to gossip, that's their affair." Mrs. Wilcox smiled slightly. "Just so, but it's as well to go forward with eyes open." She rose. "Now I've kept you from your work long enough. Supper will be ready in an hour." After the older woman left, Teresa found herself unable to concentrate on the papers before her. Dan was back. After nearly 2 months away, he had returned to Prescott. Would he call on her, send a message, or would he need time to settle back into his ranch after such a long absence? The answer came the very next day. Teresa was just dismissing her students for the afternoon when she saw him through the schoolhouse window, standing by the gate, hat in hand. Her heart gave a lurch, and she had to force herself to complete the day's instructions before sending the children on their way. Several of the students called out greetings to Dan as they passed, which he returned with a smile and nod. But his eyes remained fixed on the schoolhouse door, waiting for Teresa to emerge. When she finally stepped outside, Teresa found herself suddenly shy. Dan looked much as he had when she'd first met him, tall and solid, his face a little more weathered perhaps from the winter journey, his eyes still that startling blue that had first caught her attention. "Mr. Hawkins," she said formally, aware of curious glances from parents collecting their children. "Welcome back to Prescott." "Miss Norris," he returned with equal formality, "may I walk you home?" "I would appreciate that." They moved away from the schoolhouse in silence, maintaining a proper distance between them until they were beyond the immediate scrutiny of the town. Then Dan slowed his pace, turning to look at her properly for the first time. "You look well," he said softly. "I've missed seeing your face." The simple honesty of the statement broke through Teresa's reserve. "I've missed you too, very much." Dan's eyes warmed. "Got your letters. Read them so many times I nearly wore the paper out." "How is your sister?" Teresa asked, genuinely concerned despite her eagerness to speak of other things. "Better. Still weak, but the doctor says she'll make a full recovery with time." Dan's expression sobered. "It was close for a while, made me think about what matters, who matters." They had reached the edge of town, where the road began its gentle rise toward the surrounding hills. By unspoken agreement, they continued walking, following the path that led to a small overlook, a place they'd visited once before, on a Sunday afternoon walk in October. At the overlook, they stopped. Prescott lay below them, smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. Beyond the town, the landscape stretched away, wild, beautiful, harsh in its winter garb, yet promising renewal with spring. "I thought about you every day," Dan said, breaking the silence. "About what I left unsaid before I went." Teresa turned to face him, her heart pounding. "And what was that?" Dan took a step closer. "That you've become more important to me than I ever expected. That meeting you, knowing you, has changed something in me that I didn't know needed changing." "Dan," Teresa began, but he shook his head. "Please, let me finish. I'm not good with words like this." He took a deep breath. "When my sister was at her worst, and I thought we might lose her, all I could think was that life is too short for hesitation, too short for not saying what needs to be said." He reached for her hands, taking them gently in his. "I love you, Teresa. Probably have since the day I found you cursing that broken wagon in the desert." A laugh escaped her, half joy, half astonishment. "I was not cursing." "You were thinking about it," Dan said with a slight smile, then grew serious again. "I know it hasn't been long. I know there are those in town who'll say you could do better. But I had to tell you how I feel. Even if you don't, I love you too," Teresa interrupted, unable to bear his uncertainty a moment longer. "I think I started falling in love with you that first night at your cabin when I saw your bookshelf and realized there was so much more to you than met the eye." Relief and joy transformed Dan's features. "Really, really." Teresa squeezed his hands. "These past weeks without you. I've missed you every day. Looked for you in town, read your letters until I had them memorized, wore your brooch at Christmas and thought of you." Dan's eyes dropped to the silver rose pinned to her coat. "You're wearing it now." "Every day since it arrived," Teresa admitted. Dan released one of her hands to touch the brooch gently. "It reminded me of you, beautiful but strong, thriving where others might not." "I love it," Teresa said softly, "but not nearly as much as I love the man who sent it." Dan's gaze returned to her face, his eyes searching hers. "There'll be talk, you know, the school teacher and the rancher. Some won't approve." "Let them talk," Teresa said with more confidence than she'd ever felt about anything. "I didn't come west to live by others' expectations. I came to build a life that makes me happy." She smiled up at him. "And you, Daniel Hawkins, make me very happy." The last of Dan's reserve melted away. "Teresa," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "May I kiss you?" In answer, Teresa rose on tiptoe, her face tilted up to his. Dan lowered his head, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and filled with promise. His arms went around her, drawing her closer, and Teresa felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that she'd never experienced before. When they finally parted, Dan rested his forehead against hers. "I had a whole speech planned," he said with a soft laugh, "about taking things slow, courting you properly, giving you time to be sure. And now," Teresa asked, her arms still around his neck. Now I'm thinking life is too short to waste a single day, Dan said, his voice low and serious. If you're sure if this is what you want. It is, Teresa said simply. You are what I want. Dan kissed her again, more deeply this time, his arms tight around her as if he couldn't bear to let her go. Teresa responded with equal fervor, all her doubts and uncertainties swept away by the rightness of being in his arms. When they finally pulled apart, both a little breathless, Dan kept one arm around her waist as they looked out over the town below. I need to rebuild that storage shed the storm took down while I was gone, he said after a moment, and fix that leak in the barn roof before the next snow. Ranch needs a woman's touch, too. Curtains, maybe. Some color. Teresa leaned into his side, smiling at his practical approach to their future. Are you proposing home improvements, Mr. Hawkins, or something more? Dan turned to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious again. I'm proposing marriage, Miss Norris, a life together, if you'll have me. Despite the fact that they'd just declared their love, the directness of his proposal took Teresa's breath away. You're certain? We've known each other such a short time. I've never been more certain of anything, Dan said, taking her hands in his again. I love you. I want to build a life with you, have a family with you, grow old with you. I can't offer you luxury or society, but I can promise to love you every day of my life. To respect you, support you, cherish you. Tears filled Teresa's eyes, not of sorrow but of overwhelming joy. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions surging through her. Yes, I will marry you, Daniel Hawkins. I can't imagine a better future than one at your side. The smile that lit Dan's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. He lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around once before setting her gently back on the ground. I don't have a ring, he said, looking suddenly concerned. I wanted to ask you first, make sure you. I can get one in town tomorrow. Teresa shook her head, laughing at his worry over such a detail. The ring can wait. All that matters is that we're together. They walked back to town hand in hand, discussing their future with the excitement of those newly committed to a shared path. Dan would speak to the preacher on Sunday about the marriage service. They would need to decide whether Teresa would finish the school year. Perhaps she could continue teaching until June. Then take the summer to prepare the ranch for the possibility of opening a small school there for the children of nearby farms. There's land enough for a proper school building if we decide that's what you want, Dan said. Or you could teach in the main house for a while, see how it goes. Teresa squeezed his hand, touched by his immediate acceptance that her teaching was not just a job but a calling. We have time to figure it all out, she said. For now, I'm just happy knowing we'll be together. As they approached the boarding house, Mrs. Wilcox appeared on the porch, her expression curious but warm as she observed their linked hands and radiant faces. Mrs. Wilcox, Dan called, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. I hope you won't mind losing your starboarder come spring. Miss Norris has agreed to become Mrs. Hawkins. The older woman's face split into a broad smile. Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the pantry to get you to declare yourselves. She bustled down the steps to embrace first Teresa, then a slightly startled Dan. Couldn't be happier for you both. When's the wedding to be? We're thinking April, Teresa said, exchanging a glance with Dan for confirmation. After the worst of winter has passed, but before the end of the school term. Perfect, Mrs. Wilcox declared. Plenty of time to prepare, but not so long you'll both go mad with waiting. Now come inside, both of you. This calls for celebration. As they followed Mrs. Wilcox into the boarding house, Dan leaned down to whisper in Teresa's ear. She's right, you know. April does seem a long time to wait. Teresa smiled up at him, her heart full. It will pass before we know it. And then we'll have the rest of our lives together. Dan's answering smile was all the confirmation she needed that, despite the unexpected beginning of their story, a broken wagon, a chance encounter, his simple invitation to follow me home instead, they had found their way to exactly where they were meant to be. Spring came early to Prescott that year. By mid-March, the snow had melted from the valley, and the first wildflowers were beginning to appear on the hillsides. The townsfolk emerged from their winter confinement like bears from hibernation, eager for sunshine and renewed activity. For Teresa, the months since Dan's proposal had passed in a blur of teaching, wedding preparations, and increasingly frequent visits to the ranch that would soon be her home. Each visit revealed new improvements: curtains hung at the windows, sewn by Mrs. Wilcox, who insisted it was her wedding gift, a fresh coat of whitewash on the cabin walls, new furniture built by Dan's own hands during the long winter evenings. The announcement of their engagement had caused exactly the stir Mrs. Wilcox had predicted. Some, like the judge and the banker, offered hearty congratulations. Others, Mrs. Wilson chief among them, expressed thinly veiled disapproval of Teresa's choice to bury herself on a ranch, rather than consider the supposedly superior prospects in town. Teresa found she cared far less about such opinions than she might have a year earlier. Her life in Boston had been constrained by social expectations, her choices limited by convention. Here in the West, she had found not only freedom but also a love she hadn't known she was seeking. On the first truly warm Saturday in April, Teresa stood in Mrs. Wilcox's guest room, examining her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant ivory silk ordered from San Francisco, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in a soft style that Dan particularly liked, with a few curls framing her face and a crown of spring blossoms in place of a veil. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Wilcox said from the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Daniel won't know what hit him." Teresa turned, smiling at the woman who had become like a mother to her during these months in Prescott. "Thank you. For everything: the dress alterations, the advice, the curtains, for welcoming me when I first arrived." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilcox said briskly, though her voice wavered slightly. "It's been a joy having you here, though I'll miss you terribly once you're gone." "It's only 3 miles to the ranch," Teresa reminded her, "and you've promised to visit often." "And I will," Mrs. Wilcox assured her. "Someone has to make sure that husband of yours remembers there's more to feeding a wife than beef stew and biscuits." They both laughed, the moment of sentimentality broken. A knock at the front door downstairs announced the arrival of the judge, who had offered to escort Teresa to the church in his carriage. "It's time," Mrs. Wilcox said, squeezing Teresa's hand. "Ready?" Teresa took a deep breath. "More than ready." The church was filled to capacity when Teresa arrived. It seemed everyone in Prescott had turned out for the wedding, whether out of genuine goodwill or simple curiosity. As the judge handed her down from the carriage, Teresa caught sight of several of her students, dressed in their Sunday best, practically vibrating with excitement at seeing their teacher become a bride. Inside, the small building was transformed by spring flowers, jars of wildflowers along the aisle, a garland of blossoms across the altar rail. Teresa paused at the back, her heart beating rapidly as the small orchestra, the town's 3 musicians supplemented by a visiting violinist from Tucson, began to play, and then she saw Dan. He stood at the front of the church, tall and handsome in a new suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. As Teresa began her walk down the aisle on the judge's arm, Dan turned, and the look on his face, wonder, love, joy, made every moment of waiting worthwhile. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Teresa was aware of the preacher's words, of Dan's hand warm and steady as it held hers, of the ring, a beautiful gold band with a small diamond that Dan had chosen on a trip to Phoenix, being placed on her finger. But mostly she was aware of Dan's eyes, holding hers with a promise that went beyond the words they spoke. And then the preacher was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Dan was kissing her properly, publicly, with a restrained passion that nevertheless left no doubt of his feelings, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. The reception at the town hall afterward was a true community celebration. Everyone had contributed something: food, decorations, music. Even Mrs. Wilson, perhaps accepting the inevitable, had donated several bottles of fine wine from her husband's cellar. Teresa and Dan moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, thanking everyone for their kindness, sharing their happiness with the community that had brought them together. Later, there was dancing, Dan leading Teresa in the first dance, then yielding to the judge for the second, while he partnered Mrs. Wilcox. "You've made him very happy," the judge told Teresa as they circled the floor. "Never seen Daniel Hawkins smile so much in all the years I've known him." "He's made me happy too," Teresa said, glancing across to where Dan was attentively listening to something Mrs. Wilcox was saying. "Happier than I ever expected to be." As the afternoon progressed, Teresa found herself increasingly aware of Dan's presence, of the looks they exchanged across the room, of the brush of his hand against hers when they stood together. By the time the sun began to set, she was more than ready when Dan appeared at her side and murmured, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Hawkins." The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm ready." Their departure was accompanied by more cheers and good wishes. Dan had brought his best wagon for the occasion, freshly painted, with a comfortable seat and plenty of room for Teresa's belongings. He handed her up carefully, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. As they drove out of town, Teresa leaned against Dan's shoulder, contentment washing over her. The evening was beautiful, warm air scented with sage, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold, the distant mountains purple against the horizon. "Happy?" Dan asked, his voice low. "Completely," Teresa assured him. "And you?" In answer, Dan reined the horses to a stop. Setting the brake, he turned to face her fully. "More than I knew it was possible to be," he said, then kissed her with a thoroughness that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally continued their journey, the sun had set completely, and the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. Teresa nestled closer to Dan's side, his arm around her shoulders, keeping her warm against the evening chill. "I've been thinking," Dan said after a while, "about that day we met, your broken wagon, my offer for you to follow me home." Teresa smiled at the memory. What a strange twist of fate that was. If my wagon hadn't broken down, if you hadn't happened to be passing by. "We might never have met," Dan finished, "or at least not in the same way." He glanced down at her, his expression thoughtful in the gathering darkness. "Makes a man believe in destiny, or divine providence," Teresa suggested. "Either way, I'm grateful," Dan said simply. "For broken wagons and stubborn wheels, and whatever forces brought you into my life." As they turned onto the road leading to the ranch to their home, Teresa felt a sense of completion, of rightness, that transcended the day's celebrations. This was where she belonged. With this man in this place, building a life together. Their cabin came into view, lamplight glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney where Mrs. Wilcox's nephew had been sent ahead to light the fire. It looked exactly as a home should look, welcoming, warm, waiting for them. Dan drew the wagon to a stop in the yard. Before Teresa could move, he set the brake and jumped down, coming around to her side. Without warning, he lifted her from the seat, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. "Dan!" Teresa exclaimed, laughing as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "What are you doing, carrying my wife across the threshold?" Dan said with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "It's tradition, isn't it?" "I believe it is," Teresa agreed, relaxing into his strong embrace. As Dan carried her toward the cabin door, toward their new life together, Teresa thought again of that fateful day months ago, when a broken wagon had led to an unexpected invitation. "Follow me home instead," he'd said. And she had, finding in that simple decision the greatest happiness she'd ever known.